Imagine walking into a crowded city square, right? It's a bright sunny morning.
Okay, picture it.
And you are holding a lit lantern. You're just thrusting it into the faces of the people passing by.
Which is weird enough on its own.
Totally. But then you look them dead in the eye, and you tell them that they have just murdered the universe's ultimate authority.
Oh, wow.
Right. And instead of being horrified or, I don't know, calling the cops or something, they just look at you and laugh. They actually think it's a joke.
Yeah, they don't take it seriously at all.
Exactly. And that specific, really haunting scenario is exactly how the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche chose to announce, well, basically the most terrifying psychological crisis in human history.
Yeah, it's the famous parable of the madman. And it completely shatters this, popular cartoonish image we have of Nietzsche today.
The edgy teenager phase.
Right, exactly. We usually picture him as this patron saint of teenage angst, a guy who just wanted to burn everything down because he was angry. But when you actually read the texts, and really read them, you realize he wasn't celebrating destruction at all.
Not at all.
He was a moral psychologist. He was sounding the alarm. He was essentially looking at modern civilization and saying, you don't realize it yet, but the foundation of your entire reality just collapsed.
And that is our mission for this deep dive. We're going to examine the actual mechanics of what Nietzsche was really trying to do.
It's a huge topic.
It is, but we have a really compelling stack of research to guide us today. We're pulling from comprehensive analyses of his masterwork, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. We've got an article from Philosophy Break unpacking his most famous quotes.
Which is super helpful.
Yeah, and we're also looking at a deep dive academic paper by Hugo Brandown on the sociological impacts of his work, an essay on the influence of his intellectual companion, Lou Salome, and a really brilliant honors thesis by Jeffrey Beery dissecting the whole will to power concept.
That Beery thesis is going to be crucial later.
Oh, absolutely. The goal here is to strip away the edgy stereotypes. By the time we finish, you, the listener, are going to see your own values, the way you make choices, and the subtle anxieties of the culture you live in through a completely different lens.
A much clearer lens, hopefully.
Okay, let's look at the actual mechanics of this crisis. The famous quote, the one literally everyone knows, is God is dead.
Right, you see it on T-shirts.
Exactly. But the context of that quote is almost always stripped away.
Which is a tragedy, honestly, because the context is the whole point. What's fascinating here is that this parable appears in his 1882 work, The Gay Science.
Aphorism 125, right?
Yes, exactly. So the madman runs into the marketplace screaming, "I seek God." And the text explicitly points out that the people standing around the marketplace are atheists.
Oh, right. They are religious believers.
No, they are the educated, rational, modern people of the late 19th century.
So they're the intellectuals, the
Right.
scientists, the bourgeoisie.
Right. And to them, the non-existence of God is old news. It's a settled scientific debate. They're over it. So they mock the madman. They ask him, did God get lost? Did he board a ship and emigrate?
They're just making fun of him.
Completely. But the madman, he throws himself into the crowd, pierces them with this crazy gaze, and delivers the bombshell.
Yeah.
He doesn't just say God doesn't exist. He says, we have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers.
So the atheists in the marketplace, they think they've just solved a physics problem.
Yeah, a logic puzzle.
They think, okay, the Enlightenment happened, the scientific revolution happened, we figured out that the universe runs on natural laws, not divine intervention. We basically uninstalled this old buggy app called religion, and now we can just move on with our rational lives.
That's exactly how they see it.
But the madman is absolutely terrified. He realizes something these smart atheists don't.
He realizes that you cannot simply remove the foundational pillar of an entire civilization and expect the building to stay standing.
It's going to collapse.
Exactly. When Nietzsche says God is dead, he isn't making a theological argument about whether a guy with a beard literally exists in the clouds.
Right. It's not a debate about biology or physics.
No, he's making a sociological diagnosis. For 2,000 years, the Judeo-Christian God was the central organizing principle of Western civilization. God was the ultimate guarantor of objective truth, of morality, of human value itself.
God was the sun that the earth orbited around.
That is the exact metaphor Nietzsche uses. The madman asks these haunting, almost hallucinatory questions. He says, how are we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun?
Man, let's break down those metaphors because they're so deliberate.
They're brilliant.
Like drinking up the sea implies consuming this vast, unfathomable depth that used to contain us. Wiping away the horizon means destroying the line that gives us orientation, right? The boundary that separates the earth from the heavens.
You lose your sense of direction entirely.
But unchaining the earth from its sun, that is the most devastating one.
Because think about it. What happens to a planet when you remove its sun? It flies off into the dark. The madman asks, whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left?
That's terrifying.
It is. Without that central gravitational pull of absolute truth, all our categories of aim, unity, and being are just pulled out from under us. We are in a state of free fall. But because space is so vast, we haven't realized we're falling yet.
We're just floating, feeling fine, not realizing the ground is coming fast.
Mm-hmm.
So to really grasp the weight of this, I feel like we need to understand the psychological function that the God hypothesis was serving in the first place. Like, why did we need a sun so badly?
That's the core question.
And to answer that, we have to look back at Nietzsche's early work, specifically his fascination with the ancient Greeks, and this concept known as the wisdom of Silenus, from the Birth of Tragedy, right?
Yes, this is a crucial piece of the puzzle. So in Greek mythology, Silenus was a companion to Dionysus.
The god of wine and chaos.
Right. Wine, chaos, ecstasy. The myth goes that King Midas hunted Silenus down in the forest and demanded to know what the best and most desirable thing in the world is for mankind.
And Silenus is wanting to tell him.
He refuses at first, but Midas forces him, so Silenus laughs this terrifying, bitter laugh, and basically says, what is best of all is utterly beyond your reach, not to be born, not to be nothing, but the second best for you is to die soon.
Wow. Just brutal. It's the ultimate articulation of existential despair.
Completely. And Nietzsche argues that the ancient Greeks, they weren't just these serene, rational people walking around in white togas talking about geometry all day.
Right, the marble statue stereotype.
Exactly. They were deeply, intimately acquainted with the terror and horror of existence. They understood disease, brutal warfare, and just the chaotic, meaningless suffering of a universe that does not care about human life one bit.
The universe of becoming is a slaughterhouse. It's constant flux, constant destruction.
Yes. And the Greeks felt that psychological weight heavy on them. So how did they survive it without just giving up and dying?
They invented a coping mechanism.
Precisely. They created the Olympian gods. They projected this radiant dream world of deities into the heavens. And the gods justified human life by living it themselves, with all the passions and betrayals and sufferings, but on a grand, immortal scale.
They made the tragedy of human existence aesthetically bearable.
Right. It gave it a majestic frame.
So now take that psychological need for a coping mechanism and apply it to the Judeo-Christian framework that dominated Europe. The Christian framework solved the horror of existence, but it did so by introducing a radical shift in how we value life.
A very dangerous shift, according to Nietzsche.
Some of the contemporary analyses we reviewed make a really sharp distinction here between intrinsic and extrinsic value.
Yes, it's basically the difference between doing something for its own sake and doing something to get a reward later.
Like intrinsic value means the thing is valuable in and of itself. Extrinsic value means the thing is only valuable as an instrument. It's a stepping stone to something else.
Exactly. Like, if you're painting a canvas simply because the act of painting brings you profound joy and fulfillment, that is intrinsic.
You just love the paint.
Right. But if you hate painting, but you're doing it because someone is going to pay you $1 million for the canvas, the act of painting only has extrinsic value. It's just a tool to get the money.
Okay, so apply that to the history of Western morality. Nietzsche argues that the Judeo-Christian worldview provided an incredibly powerful but entirely extrinsic value to earthly life.
Completely extrinsic.
The core doctrine essentially stated that this physical world, your body, your earthly desires, the suffering you endure, all of it is inherently flawed. It's fallen, it's temporary, it's a veil of tears.
Right. The true value of your existence is not located here. It is located in the afterlife, in the kingdom of heaven.
This world is just a testing ground for the next. You endure the suffering of this life for the sake of the reward in the true world. You live extrinsically.
But then the Enlightenment happens.
The scientific revolution happens. The intellectual class of the 19th century slowly dismantles the feasibility of that true world. They point their telescopes at the sky and Well, they don't find heaven.
They study biology and find evolution, not divine creation.
They kill God.
And here's the catastrophe. When you kill God, you don't just lose a Sunday ritual, you lose the entire extrinsic motivation for enduring the suffering of life.
The paycheck at the end is gone.
The destination that justified the journey has been exposed as a mirage. And because European civilization spent 2,000 years devaluing this physical world in favor of the next one, there is no intrinsic value left to fall back on.
We bankrupted the meaning of the earth, and then we destroyed the bank.
That is a perfect way to put it.
So this brings us to the core crisis, nihilism. When the highest values devaluate themselves, we hit the void.
The abyss.
But Nietzsche realizes that human beings are going to react to this free fall in very different ways. He splits the reaction into two distinct psychological paths, passive nihilism and active nihilism.
Which are total opposites.
Let's look at passive nihilism first, because that's the one he really saw infecting his own society.
Right. So passive nihilism is deeply rooted in the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, who, by the way, was a massive early influence on Nietzsche.
Schopenhauer was the king of pessimism.
Oh, the absolute king. He essentially looked at the world, saw the suffering, and concluded that the fundamental nature of reality was this blind, striving will that could never be satisfied.
Just constant wanting and pain.
Yeah. So his solution was a kind of ascetic resignation. Turn away from the world, suppress your desires, and seek a quiet, numb detachment.
Schopenhauer basically hears the wisdom of Silenus and says, yep, the satyr is right. It's better not to be, so let's just minimize our existence as much as possible.
Exactly. So when the passive nihilist realizes that the true world is a fiction, their reaction is profound despair. They don't have the psychological strength to create their own meaning, so they just give up.
They just deflate.
Yeah, they experience this all-pervading numbness. Their entire existence becomes about seeking comfort, minimizing pain, and finding whatever small, temporary pleasures will numb that existential dread.
They aren't trying to build anything.
No, they don't try to build anything new. They just want to sedate themselves against the meaninglessness.
It's essentially a society-wide depression. Like, think of my analogy. It's like society's entire operating system just crashed. The atheists laughing in the marketplace think it's a joke, but they don't realize the cultural roof is about to collapse on their heads.
They're oblivious.
Passive nihilism is sitting in the rubble, wrapping a blanket around yourself, and just waiting for the end.
A very bleak picture.
But Nietzsche wasn't a passive nihilist. He proposed an alternative, which sounds almost contradictory at first, active nihilism.
Right.
How do you actively believe in nothing?
Well, by recognizing that nothingness isn't a dead end, it is a clearing of the ground. For Nietzsche, active nihilism is actually a sign of increased power of the spirit.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The active nihilist also looks at the death of God and the collapse of objective morality. But instead of feeling despair, they feel an immense radical sense of liberation.
They see the unchained earth, and instead of panicking about the lack of a sun, they realize they can steer the planet themselves.
Yes. Nietzsche describes this realization not as a tragedy, but as a scarcely describable kind of light, happiness, relief, and exhilaration.
An open sea.
The horizon has been wiped away. That means there are no more boundaries. There are no more divine laws telling you what you cannot do or what is inherently sinful.
So the active nihilist intentionally destroys the old, lingering, broken values so that they can actively build new intrinsic values from the ground up.
Right. You clear the debris to build something better.
So passive nihilism is sitting in the rubble and crying. Active nihilism is taking that rubble, realizing you don't need the original divine architect's blueprints anymore, and deciding to build your own house, to your own design, for the sheer joy of building it.
It is the shift from a world that has inherent meaning handed down from above to a world where meaning must be forged from within.
But, and this is a big but, Nietzsche faces a massive communication problem here.
A huge one.
He knows that if he just writes a dense 600-page academic treatise saying, hey, humanity, your extrinsic value system has collapsed, please engage in active nihilism to construct new intrinsic paradigms, no one is going to read it.
Oh, definitely not. It's too dry.
He's dealing with a psychological crisis, a crisis of the soul, not a math error. To cure a culture that has lost its defining myth, you can't just give them logic, you have to give them a new myth.
And that brilliant realization leads to the creation of his masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He basically abandons the traditional argumentative essay format entirely.
He writes a novel.
He writes a philosophical fiction. He creates a prophet.
And the choice of the name Zarathustra is so brilliant. and steeped in historical irony. He names his protagonist after the ancient Persian prophet Zoroaster. But why choose the founder of Zoroastrianism to be the mouthpiece for a philosophy that destroys religion?
Because Zoroaster is, historically speaking, patient zero.
Patient zero.
Yeah, he's the original architect of the moral binary. The historical Zoroaster was one of the first thinkers to portray the entire cosmos as a strict moral battlefield, a cosmic war between a god of light and a god of darkness, good versus evil.
Ah.
He was the first to conceive of a linear timeline of history that ends in a judgment day, where the good are rewarded with eternal life and the evil are plunged into an abyss.
He literally invented the metaphysical framework that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam would later adapt and popularize. He invented the extrinsic true world behind this one.
Exactly. So Nietzsche resurrects him. He brings Zarathustra back as a literary character to atone for his historical mistake.
To fix the bug he coded.
Right. Zarathustra returns from the mountain not to preach a new religion, but to teach humanity how to remain faithful to the earth. He comes to undo the error he started.
And Zarathustra's core, teaching the actual roadmap for how an individual mind survives the death of God, is laid out right at the beginning of the book in a discourse called On the Three Metamorphoses of the Spirit.
It's his most famous allegory.
He outlines a psychological evolution that every person must go through: the camel, the lion, and the child. Let's really look at the mechanics of this, starting with the camel.
Okay, so the camel is the beast of burden. Think about the physical act of what a camel does. It kneels down in the sand willingly to be loaded with heavy weight.
It wants the baggage.
For Nietzsche, the camel represents the human spirit weighed down by the heavy burdens of traditional values, cultural expectations, and absolute moral laws. It is the spirit that is characterized by the phrase, "thou shalt."
It's the spirit of reverence. And I think we all start here. Like, think about your own intellectual growth. It's the student memorizing the textbooks, the citizen obeying the laws without questioning their origin, the religious believer following the dogma. You kneel down and say, "Tell me what is true. Load me up with the rules of the past."
Right, and that weight is actually necessary at first. You need discipline to build character. But the text says the camel speeds into the desert, and the desert is the landscape of nihilism.
So what happens there?
You carry all these heavy traditional values into the modern world, and you suddenly realize the desert is empty. The God who supposedly authored these values is dead. The weight you are carrying is foundationless.
It's just weight for the sake of weight.
Exactly. The psychological burden becomes unbearable. The rules demand you sacrifice your earthly desires for a heavenly reward, but you realize the reward isn't there.
There's no oasis.
No, the camel cannot survive in the desert of nihilism if it remains a camel. It will simply collapse under the weight of passive nihilism.
You burn out. You realize the system is rigged or empty. So to survive, the spirit must undergo its first radical transformation. The camel must become a lion. What is the psychology of the lion?
The lion is the rebel. The defining characteristic of the lion is its ferocity and its desire for absolute freedom. The lion wants to conquer its own territory in the desert. But to claim that freedom, it has to fight the reigning lord of the desert.
And Nietzsche's imagery here is just incredible. The Lord of the Desert is a great dragon. It's covered in golden scales, and glittering on every single scale are the words, "thou shalt."
It's such a vivid image. The dragon is the physical manifestation of 2,000 years of objective morality. It is every societal norm, every absolute truth, every external expectation that tries to dictate human behavior.
It's the ultimate boss fight.
And the lion's power is that it has the strength to fight this dragon. It recognizes that the dragon is a relic.
So the lion is the active nihilist in the destructive phase. The lion's roar is the sacred no. It rejects the dragon. It shifts the paradigm from the camel's obedient "thou shalt" to the lion's defiant "I will."
But the tragedy of the lion is that it is trapped in a negative relationship with the world.
What do you mean?
The lion can only destroy. It is fiercely independent, it can clear the space, it can tear down the broken institutions, but a roar is not a philosophy. A sacred no leaves you with an empty, scorched desert. The lion cannot create new values.
Ah, I see. If you stay a lion forever, you just become a cynic.
Exactly.
You're the person in the boardroom who brilliantly shoots down every bad idea but never proposes a new one. Or you're the revolutionary who successfully overthrows the corrupt government but then has no idea how to build a functioning society in its place.
You just stay angry.
Right. So destruction is only half the task. To actually overcome nihilism and build a new house, the spirit requires a second, final metamorphosis. The predatory roaring lion must become a child.
Which seems super counterintuitive at first. Like, why regress from a powerful, independent beast of prey to a vulnerable child?
Yeah, that always confused me.
Well, Nietzsche isn't talking about childishness. He's talking about a specific psychological state. He writes that the child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-propelling wheel, a first movement, a sacred experience.
Let's focus on forgetting, because the lion's entire identity is tied to the past. The lion remembers the heavy burdens, remembers the dragon, and fights against them. The lion is defined by what it opposes.
Right.
But the child forgets the dragon entirely.
Because the child plays. When a child builds a sandcastle, they don't build it in defiance of an older, broken sandcastle. They build it out of pure, intrinsic joy. They create their own rules for their own game.
They aren't reacting, they're creating.
Exactly. They don't need external validation, and they don't need an objective cosmic law to justify their play.
The spirit of the child is the creator of new, intrinsic values. The child says a sacred yes to life, entirely on its own terms. True mastery is becoming the child. You play the game of life on your own terms.
That journey from camel to lion to child is the ultimate blueprint for self-actualization in a post-God world. You learn the rules, you realize the rules are broken, and you destroy them, and then you reinvent the game.
But this brings up a massive mechanical question.
Okay.
What is actually powering this metamorphosis? Why does the camel want to become the lion? Why doesn't the spirit just stay kneeling in the sand? What is the fuel in the tank that drives human beings to overcome themselves?
This is where things get really complicated.
Right, and this leads us to perhaps the most infamous, the most widely misunderstood phrase in all of Nietzsche's work, the will to power.
The will to power, wow. It is a concept that carries so much dark historical baggage.
So much baggage.
For decades, it was associated with authoritarianism, fascism, and social Darwinism. The Nazis basically adopted it as a slogan. But to understand what Nietzsche was actually diagnosing, we have to meticulously dismantle those associations.
We reviewed a fantastic honors thesis by Jeffrey Beery that does exactly this. Beery suggests the best way to understand the will to power is to first rigorously define what it is not.
That's the safest approach.
So let's start with the biggest misconception. The will to power is not a metaphysical force.
Right. It is not an objective law of physics for ambition. This interpretation was heavily popularized by philosophers like Martin Heidegger in the 20th century.
How did Heidegger see it?
Well, Heidegger read Nietzsche as making a grand ontological claim about the fundamental nature of the universe, that everything, from atoms colliding in space to galaxies forming, is literally just power centers clashing and seeking domination.
It turns the will to power into something like the Force in Star Wars. A mystical, invisible energy field that binds the galaxy together and drives everything toward conflict.
Which sounds cool, but it's completely wrong.
Why does Beery and modern Nietzsche scholarship in general reject this interpretation?
Because it completely contradicts the core of Nietzsche's entire philosophical project. Nietzsche was fiercely, famously anti-metaphysical. He spent his entire career attacking the idea of absolute transcendent truth, hidden structures behind reality, and Kant's idea of things in themselves.
He hated all of that.
He viewed metaphysics as the ultimate prejudice of philosophers, a cowardly attempt to invent a hidden world because they couldn't handle the chaos of the real one.
So why would he invent his own?
Exactly. Why would a thinker who spent 30 years systematically dismantling every objective foundation of reality secretly construct his own grand, invisible, objective foundation at the last minute?
It would make him a colossal hypocrite. And there's a massive historical asterisk regarding the source text that people use to support the metaphysical interpretation. The passages where Nietzsche sounds the most like Heidegger, saying things like, "This world is the will to power and nothing besides." Those quotes almost never appear in the books he actually published during his lifetime.
This is the darkest part of his legacy. They come from his nachlass, his unpublished notebooks. And after Nietzsche suffered his mental collapse in 1889, his sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, took control of his estate.
And she had her own agenda.
She gathered his discarded notes, heavily edited them, cherry-picked them out of context, and published them as a book called The Will to Power.
And Elisabeth was married to a prominent German nationalist and virulent anti-Semite. She actively manipulated her brother's unfinished experimental thoughts to align with proto-fascist nationalist ideologies, ideologies that Nietzsche himself openly despised and mocked while he was sane.
He literally hated anti-Semites. It is one of the great tragedies of literary history. Relying on those heavily doctored posthumous notes to claim Nietzsche was building a metaphysical system is fundamentally flawed. If a thought wasn't polished and published in the works he signed his name to, we shouldn't treat it as his definitive doctrine.
Okay, so it's not a mystical metaphysical force. Beery also points out it's not just a poetic metaphor either.
Right, that's the other extreme.
Some scholars try to rescue Nietzsche from the fascist baggage by swinging entirely in the opposite direction. They say, oh, the will to power is just a literary device. It's just Nietzsche using a metaphor to describe the world from his specific artistic perspective. It doesn't actually exist.
But that strips the concept of its diagnostic power. If it's just a poem, it doesn't explain the fierce biological and psychological realities Nietzsche's trying to unpack.
So if it's not metaphysical magic and it's not just a poem, what is it?
Beery lands on the most grounded, textually supported interpretation. The will to power is a first-order psychological drive. It is the fundamental, underlying psychological reality that motivates human behavior.
How does that differ from basic evolutionary biology? Like Schopenhauer talked about the will to live, Darwin talked about survival of the fittest. Isn't this just the biological urge to not die?
No, because Nietzsche explicitly rejects the idea that survival is our primary motivation. He argues that biological survival is just the baseline, the bare minimum. A living thing doesn't just want to passively exist. It wants to discharge its strength. It wants to grow, to expand, to overcome obstacles, to master its environment.
Like trees don't just want to not die. They push their roots through solid concrete, they compete for sunlight, they expand, they overcome.
Exactly. The will to power is the psychological drive for mastery, growth, and self-overcoming. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Nietzsche uses this psychological lens as a scalpel to dissect everything humanity does, even our highest, most seemingly noble and objective pursuits.
Let's look at how he dissects the will to truth. We generally view the pursuit of truth, the scientist in the laboratory, the philosopher in the library, the priest seeking divine revelation. We view that as a pure, detached, objective quest for knowledge. We think we just want to know the truth for the sake of the truth.
And Nietzsche says that is an absolute illusion. He asks, psychoanalytically, what in us really wants truth? And he concludes that the will to truth is actually just a highly refined, sublimated subset of the will to power.
That is a wild claim. Walk us through the mechanics of that. How is a scientist discovering a law of physics exercising power?
Think back to the terror of the Greek universe. The world of becoming is chaotic, unpredictable, and terrifying. It is a flux of sensory data that just overwhelms us.
Right.
What does the scientist do? The scientist observes that chaos finds patterns, creates formulas, and establishes physical laws. By doing so, they make the chaotic world thinkable.
And by making it thinkable, they make it predictable. By understanding it, they control it.
Precisely. When a theologian creates a rigid, dogmatic moral system that explains exactly why bad things happen and what happens after you die, they are asserting control over the terrifying unknown of mortality. Truth is an instrument we create to tame the chaos of existence. And in doing so, we elevate our own sense of mastery over our environment. We exercise our will to power.
Okay, but hold on. I have a crucial pushback here.
Let's hear it.
If you're telling me that the ultimate human drive, the engine beneath every action, is the drive for power, expansion, and mastery, wait, you are basically writing a blank check for every tyrant, dictator, and bully in history to oppress people. How is the will to power not just a fancy philosophical justification for fascism and the subjugation of the weak?
That is the most vital pushback, and it's the exact trap that 20th century fascists fell into. But Nietzsche addresses this directly in his psychological breakdown of the will. He differentiates between two expressions of this drive, commanding and obeying.
Okay, unpack that for me.
He writes, whatever lives, obeys. And crucially, he who cannot obey himself is commanded.
He who cannot obey himself is commanded. That's deep.
When we think of power, our modern minds immediately go to political power, physical domination, power over others. But Nietzsche argues that the desire to harm, dominate, or oppress other people actually stems from a profound weakness.
Really? Weakness?
Yes, it is a sign of a frustrated, impoverished will to power.
So it's the classic psychology of the schoolyard bully. The bully beats up the smaller kid, not because the bully is truly strong, secure, and masterful, but because the bully lacks internal strength and emotional control. Their internal life is chaotic, so they seek a cheap, external hit of power by dominating someone weaker.
That's exactly it. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche explicitly notes that the desire to hurt others shows a sense of frustration in the face of a poverty of power. True, healthy, flourishing will to power is not about dominating your neighbor, it is about self-mastery. It is about the active will commanding itself.
You direct that raw drive from mastery inward.
Yes. Human psychology is a chaotic battleground of competing drives, passions, fears, and animalistic instincts. The truly powerful individual, the one who has successfully metamorphosed into the child, takes that internal chaos and organizes it.
They discipline themselves.
They become the master of their own impulses. They sublimate their raw drives into art, into philosophy, into rigorous self-discipline. They give style to their own character.
They don't need to conquer a neighboring country because they have successfully conquered themselves. The tyrant is actually a slave to his own neuroses, lashing out at the world because he has no internal control.
Exactly. The true exemplar of the will to power is the artist who commands a blank canvas, or the thinker who overcomes their own biases.
The active will sets its own goals, overcomes its own inherent weaknesses, and takes full responsibility for its own laws. It obeys the commands it gives to itself, and therefore it does not need to be commanded by the external dragon of thou shalt.
Perfect summary.
So if the will to power is the engine driving us toward this intense self-mastery, where's the ultimate destination? What does a human being look like when they have fully actualized this drive?
The destination, according to Zarathustra, is the Übermensch.
And the final exam to prove you've reached that destination is a terrifying concept called the internal recurrence. But let's start with the destination.
To understand what the Übermensch is, we first have to understand its opposite. Nietzsche often defines his ideals by contrasting them with what he utterly despises.
Makes sense.
In Zarathustra, he paints a prophetic, deeply unsettling vision of what humanity will become if we fail to actively overcome nihilism, if we just succumb to passive comfort. He calls this figure the last man.
The descriptions of the last man in the text are chilling, because they feel like a direct diagnosis of 21st century modern culture.
Oh, absolutely. The last man is the ultimate pathetic outcome of passive nihilism. It is a society that has abandoned all great goals, all striving, all tension. They no longer shoot the arrow of their longing beyond mankind. They want only comfort, security, and absolute equality.
Nietzsche writes, "The earth has become small, and upon it hops the last man who makes everything small. They avoid all risk."
They don't want to rule because ruling takes effort and invites resentment. They don't want to obey because obeying is uncomfortable. They want everyone to be exactly the same.
Any difference, any excellence is viewed as a threat to the comfortable equilibrium of the herd.
And my favorite, darkest line from that section, a little poison now and then that produces pleasant dreams, and a lot of poison at last for a pleasant death.
Man, look at our culture. Mindless algorithmic scrolling, binge-watching content for 10 hours a day, the constant self-medication to numb the low-level anxiety of a meaningless existence.
It's all poison for pleasant dreams.
The last man have eradicated intense suffering, but in doing so, they have eradicated all potential for greatness. And then, as the text says, they blink and say, "We have discovered happiness."
The last man is a human being entirely devoid of the will to power as self-overcoming. They have surrendered to the void. And it is against this pathetic, blinking, anesthetized herd that Zarathustra proposes the alternative, the Übermensch.
Often translated as the Superman or the Overman. And again, we must aggressively clear away the Nazi baggage here.
Yeah.
The Übermensch is not an Aryan master race. It has absolutely nothing to do with biology, genetics, or nationalistic superiority.
Not at all. The Übermensch is a purely psychological and philosophical evolution. It is the individual who has fully actualized the will to power as internal self-mastery.
The child.
Yes. They have realized that God is dead. They have stared unblinkingly into the terrifying abyss of nihilism. They have gone through the metamorphoses of the camel and the lion, and they have emerged as the child. They are the sovereign creators of new, earthly, intrinsic values.
They say, "This is my good. This I love. I do not want it as divine law." They don't impose their values on others as universal truths. They embody them as their own personal aesthetic triumph. They are the ultimate individuals living entirely out of intrinsic motivation.
But Nietzsche poses a brutal challenge here. It's easy to claim you've created your own values. It's easy to say you love your life. How do you actually know if you've achieved this state?
Right, how do you measure it?
How do you measure if your values are truly, deeply life-affirming? To answer this, Nietzsche introduces a thought experiment, a psychological litmus test of immense weight. He calls it the eternal recurrence.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This appears in the Gay Science, aphorism 341. It is a staggering proposition. I'll just summarize it quickly.
Go for it.
Nietzsche asks, what if, one day or night, a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. And there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence.
Think about the physics of that for a second. Nietzsche actually played with the idea that if time is infinite and matter is finite, then mathematically every possible configuration of matter must eventually repeat itself infinitely.
Like a cosmic reset.
Right. But the cosmological physics isn't the point. The psychological weight is the point. Not an afterlife in heaven where all your tears are wiped away. Not a hell where you are punished. Just an infinite closed loop of exactly this life.
Every profound heartbreak, every humiliating mistake, every boring Tuesday afternoon waiting in line at the bank, returning over and over for eternity.
Forever.
This is the ultimate existential lie detector test. If you truly believe the universe loops forever, how do you react to the demon's message? Nietzsche asks, would you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine?
That reaction is the dividing line of humanity. The last man, the passive nihilist, the person who secretly hates their life and is only enduring it in the hopes of some extrinsic reward in heaven, they would be absolutely crushed by the eternal recurrence.
It would be the ultimate nightmare.
It exposes the fact that their life has no intrinsic value.
But the Übermensch.
The Übermensch embraces a concept Nietzsche calls amorphity, love of one's fate. They don't just tolerate their life. They don't just accept it. They actively, passionately love every single second of it.
Who's good and the bad?
Because they understand that the pain, the suffering, and the joy are inextricably linked. Every moment was a necessary brushstroke in the masterpiece they have created of themselves. If you can look at the prospect of living your exact life over and over for eternity and genuinely say, yes, bring it on, then you have successfully created intrinsic value. You have justified your own existence without needing a god to do it for you.
There is a wild, almost hallucinatory vision in Zarathustra that illustrates the psychological violence of this realization. It's the vision of the shepherd.
Yes, in the section on the vision and the riddle, Zarathustra is walking, and he suddenly sees a young shepherd writhing on the ground, gagging, his face distorted in absolute terror. A heavy black snake has crawled into the shepherd's mouth and bitten fast to the back of his throat.
What does the black snake represent?
The snake is the metaphor for the spirit of gravity. It represents the absolute nausea, the choking despair of the meaninglessness of life. It is the heaviest thought of the eternal recurrence, physically suffocating the passive spirit.
It sounds awful.
Zarathustra tries to pull the snake out with his hands, but he can't. He can't just pull nihilism out of someone. So he yells at the shepherd, "Bite! Bite its head off!"
And the shepherd bites down. He bites the head off the snake of nihilism, spits it far away, and springs to his feet.
And then, the text says, he laughs. But it is no longer a human laughter. It is the laugh of the Übermensch. It is the profound, terrifying joy of a spirit that has confronted the absolute worst reality imaginable. The infinite loop of meaningless suffering, and through sheer will to power, has transmuted that suffering into a sacred, life-affirming yes.
He has conquered the nausea not by escaping it, but by destroying it from within.
Beautifully said.
So we have explored these towering godlike concepts, the death of the universe's central authority, the psychological engine of the will to power, the evolutionary leap of the Übermensch, and the brutal final exam of the eternal recurrence. It's a heroic, almost intimidating philosophical architecture.
Very intimidating.
But this brings us to a crucial historical reality check. We have to look at the man who is actually writing these words. Did Friedrich Nietzsche pass his own test? Did he live the life of the booming, triumphant Übermensch?
To answer that with any honesty, we have to look at his personal life during the exact period he was formulating these ideas. And the essay detailing his relationship with the brilliant Lou Salome provides an invaluable, devastating window into his reality.
Lou Salome was an intellectual powerhouse. Born in St. Petersburg, spoke multiple languages fluently, and she moved seamlessly through the highest intellectual circles of Europe. She wasn't a disciple, she was a peer.
In 1882, she travels to Rome and meets Paul Ray, who was a philosopher and arguably Nietzsche's closest friend at the time. Ray falls madly in love with her. He writes to Nietzsche essentially saying, "You have to come to Rome. I've met the most extraordinary woman."
And so Nietzsche shows up.
Nietzsche arrives, and despite his usual intense isolation, he too falls instantly, deeply in love with the 21-year-old Salome.
And we have to remember who Nietzsche was physically and socially. He wasn't a commanding, robust presence.
No, not at all.
He was painfully awkward. He suffered from crippling migraines that would leave him bedridden for days. His eyesight was so poor he was practically blind. And he lived a life of intense nomadic solitude, moving from cheap boarding house to cheap boarding house.
Very lonely.
But he meets Salome, and he is captivated. He tells people she is the smartest person he has ever met. He considers her his absolute intellectual equal, which was incredibly rare for him.
The three of them, Nietzsche, Ray, and Salome, form this intensely intellectual, highly unconventional triad. They travel together, they debate philosophy, psychology, and religion for hours on end.
There's that famous photograph, right?
The Holy Trinity photo taken in Lucerne. Ray and Nietzsche are hooked up to a small cart like beasts of burden, and Salome is kneeling in the cart, brandishing a small whip.
It's a wild subversion of 19th century gender dynamics. But it also hints heavily at the psychological depths and imbalances of their relationship. Nietzsche was enthralled, but the romantic aspect was a complete disaster for him. He proposes marriage to her.
And she rejects him.
He proposes again. She rejects him again. She wanted a deep intellectual companionship, advocating for a commune-like living situation where they could just study and debate, but she absolutely refused to be tied down by marriage to him.
And the rejection utterly devastates him. The triad breaks apart, Salome goes off with Ray, and Nietzsche feels profoundly betrayed. He retreats into an absolute crushing solitude.
That's heartbreaking.
And it is in the immediate aftermath of this heartbreak, isolated in the mountains, battling severe physical illness, vomiting, and near blindness, that he feverishly writes, "Thus spoke Zarathustra."
Wow. Which makes Lou Salome's subsequent analysis of him so poignant. Years later, in 1894, she writes one of the very first comprehensive books about Nietzsche and his philosophy.
So you knew him better than almost anyone.
And she makes a profound observation that changes how you read everything he wrote. She says, every great philosophy has been the personal confession of its author and a form of involuntary and unperceived memoir.
This raises an important question. If philosophy is autobiography, what is the triumphant, world-conquering prophet Zarathustra telling us about the sick, lonely, rejected Friedrich Nietzsche?
Stark contrast.
Salome noted a massive discrepancy between his inner reality and his outward philosophical posture. She wrote that when she first met him, his studied, elegant posture surprised her, but she quickly realized it was a meticulously crafted mask.
A mask covering what?
Covering a deeply emotional, hypersensitive, profoundly suffering human being. Nietzsche himself wrote elsewhere that every profound spirit needs a mask. His philosophy of the Übermensch, this booming, joyful, conquering hero who bites the head off the snake of nihilism and laughs at eternity. Salome recognized this wasn't a description of who Nietzsche actually was.
It was a description of what he needed to be.
Exactly, what he desperately needed to be in order to survive his own agonizing reality.
It's like pulling back the curtain on The Wizard of Oz. You read Zarathustra, and you expect the author to be this towering, terrifying, all-powerful figure. But behind the curtain, you find a small, vulnerable man in physical agony.
Yeah, but with a crucial difference.
Right. The crucial difference here is that Nietzsche isn't a fraud. He isn't a charlatan trying to trick the populace for money or power. He is a man that is so profound. Let's bring this all together. We start in the marketplace with the madman announcing the death of God. The terrifying realization that the extrinsic value we placed on life, the comforting illusion of a true world behind this one, has evaporated under the light of modern rationality.
Which plunges civilization into the desert of nihilism, the realization that the universe has no inherent objective meaning, leaving us vulnerable to the passive despair of the last man.
And in that desert, we have to evolve to survive. The camel, dutifully carrying the heavy burdens of dead traditions, must become the lion, fiercely roaring no to the broken rules.
And the lion must eventually become the child.
Saying a sacred yes to the creation of a new, self-authored game of life.
Driven not by a desire to dominate others, but by the will to power directed inward, the psychological engine we use to conquer our own weaknesses, to master our internal chaos, and to grow.
Leading us toward the ideal of the Übermensch. The sovereign individual who can face the terrifying thought experiment of the eternal recurrence, the prospect of living their exact life with all its pain on an infinite loop and passionately say, Amor fati, I love it, I wouldn't change a single detail.
All while remembering that the man who mapped this heroic journey did so while crawling through his own personal desert, using these towering ideas as a mask and a shield against his own profound suffering.
Incredible. And before we end, I want to leave you with one final, incredibly provocative thought.
Oh, the Brandome paper?
Yes, we reviewed a fascinating academic paper by sociologist Hugo Brandome that looks at the aftermath of Nietzsche's diagnosis. Nietzsche predicted the death of the rigid, moral, ultimate foundation God of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And in many ways, looking at the decline of institutional religion in the West, he was right. The cultural roof did collapse.
It did.
But did the human impulse for religion actually disappear?
No, it didn't. Brandone argues that religiosity, the deep human impulse for the divine and the sacred, did not retract in our postmodern era. It simply resignified itself. It adapted.
Exactly. Brandon suggests an incredible irony. By killing the absolute dogmatic God of institutions, Nietzsche inadvertently paved the way for the resurgence of a highly individualized, personalized human God in the 21st century.
Just think about the landscape of modern spirituality. People are no longer adopting wholesale, rigid dogmas.
No, they're mixing and matching.
They're taking a little bit of Buddhism, a little bit of secular mindfulness, a personal connection to nature, maybe some Stoicism, and they are crafting their own bespoke belief systems.
The death of absolute dogma actually allowed a more flexible, subjective spirituality to thrive. People are essentially acting as the creators of their own spiritual values, much like the child in the Metamorphosis.
It's fascinating.
So the lingering question is, this is postmodern religion survived, precisely because it unconsciously adopted Nietzsche's perspectivism. Did Nietzsche, the great assassin of the universal God, actually just clear the ground for us to invent thousands of new, deeply personal gods?
It is a brilliant paradox. He killed the objective God, but perhaps he birthed the era of the subjective personal God.
Something for you to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I encourage you to examine your own tablets of values. Are you carrying burdens that belong to a dead system? Are you stuck in the angry roar of the lion? Or are you finding a way to say a sacred yes to your own life? Because at the end of the day, when you step back into the diagnostic muddy waters of your own existence, no one else can write the prescription. You have to be the one to dive in, find the broken pieces, and decide for yourself what it means to heal. We'll see you next time.